I hope everyone can hear me. I'm zooming in from a high school gym, which is proof that classics is everywhere. We are delighted to have been a part of the Big Read program. It's our mission in the Department of Classics to share our love and understanding of ancient Greek and Roman culture with Kansans all over the state. And so it's been particularly nice to get to know some of the folks in Wichita and to discuss this work with you all over the past month. I will make an offer that we are always available and our emails are readily online at the KU Classics Department homepage if anyone would like to contact us for further questions or ideas or conversations. But for now, let me draw attention to your presenter for tonight. Dr. Paul Touyz was educated. He got his undergraduate degree at the University of Sydney, where he majored in classics and in German. And then he went and did graduate work, earning his PhD at Princeton University. He joined our faculty in 2018, and just in that short time, he has already reinvigorated us with his enthusiasm and his talent. Dr. Touyz teaches courses in ancient Greek and Roman culture, history, and literature. His particular research specialty is Greek drama, particularly the satyr play, which is a kind of Greek dramatic production that doesn't get as much of the limelight as others do. But Paul is working to remedy that and studying this fascinating genre in a fascinating period of Greek history. And this evening, he is going to present about Circe's infamous niece, Medea. So Dr. Touyz.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Tara, and thank you, Julie, for inviting me to present here. It's very exciting. First of all, can everybody hear me? I know that Julie has asked everybody to send messages through the chat, so if there is a problem, please do let her know or put up a little hand or something to make sure at least that I'm aware that there's a problem and I can try to fix it on my end. And beyond that, as Julie did mention, I am planning on leaving plenty of time for questions, and I will make space during the talk for questions as well. And I can see a few hands and a few messages. It seems to be working well so far. This is great. Next step then is to get the slides up. Make this a bit more entertaining than just my face. Okay, here we are. We have some slides, and that should be all you see now. Okay, so tonight I'm going to talk a bit about Circe and her niece Medea. And what I'm really going to try to explore is the relationship between these two figures in both myth, the poetic tradition of ancient Greece, and how these two threads feed into chapter 13 of Madeline Miller's novel, in which Circe and Medea meet. Right. Now, these two figures, as I'll explain in a little moment, related in myth, and that's certainly something that's drawn out in the novel, but their relationship also is has been explored in painting and artwork, as we see here. I'm a fan of the pre-Raphaelites, and we have here John William Waterhouse's versions of Circe and Medea. Right. Now, what attracted people like Waterhouse to both of these figures is that they played similar roles in the myths in which they occupy prominent positions. Right? So Circe, of course, features prominently in the Odyssey in a relationship to Odysseus as the femme fatale almost, both a dangerous witch figure as well as a helper. And similarly, Medea, in his, you can see this here in Waterhouse's later painting, also a witch, also helping Jason, but also a threat, and a threat that's going to be deadly indeed in the case of Jason and his children. So their relationship isn't just one to do with their ancestry in myth, but it's also one to do with the parts that they play in the myths in which that have made them famous, and in particular the narratives that have given form to those myths. So that's what I'll be exploring. Okay, so in outline then, what I'm going to be talking about is what precisely the ancestral relationship between Circe and Medea is in Greek myth. And then I'll talk a bit more about the relationship between these two figures in the poetic tradition. This is going to be a section of the talk in which I reveal many of my own interests, as well as the sorts of things I get up to when I'm not teaching. This is the sort of stuff that many scholars have poured a lot of work and effort into. I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty of it. I just want to highlight a few interesting aspects of that poetic relationship, which is developed then in the final section to do with the actual encounter between Circe and Medea. Okay, so that's it in outline. I'll try pausing halfway after the business of the poetic tradition so we can have questions and answers. Okay, so launching right in then, myth and genealogy. This, if you've come to this talk having already read Circe by Madeline Miller, should not come as a surprise. Circe is the daughter of Helios, a sun god, Titan in fact, and an Oceanid, Perse. And that means, at least in the version offered to us by Madeline Miller, that she is the sister of some other very famous mythical characters, Pasiphae, Perses, and Aeetes, who's going to be especially important in this talk. Right? Now, I'll come back to this in a moment, but what Miller gives us is one version of this mythology. In another version, another important one from antiquity, this one by Hesiod, there are only two siblings, Circe and Aeetes, right? So that relationship in particular is one that is especially important. I want to unpack that relationship a little bit in order to understand the relationship between Circe and Aeetes' daughter, Medea, right? On top of this, Circe lives on the island of Aia, and of course, she comes to us mostly from the story of Odysseus in the Odyssey in particular. Medea, by contrast, the niece of Circe, the daughter of Circe's brother Aeetes and another Oceanid. She comes from the city of Colchis, the land of Colchis, which is also called, interestingly, in the ancient testimony, Aya, the land of Aya. Right? And by contrast to Circe, she is Medea, that is more famous from the play Medea by Euripides, as well as the much later epic by Apollonius of Rhodes, the Argonautica. Right? These two other sources, Medea and the Argonautica, are hugely influential just in general, but they have a marked presence also in the novel by Madeline Miller. Right? So these two figures related in the genealogy in myth already, and here we have a depiction of that. I'm not sure what those yellow lines are, they've just appeared, but in any case, this gives us an idea of what I'm talking about, graphic depiction of what I was just explaining. So we have Helios, sun god, Aeetes over here, and I just need to move that, and Circe across here. Right? Okay. Those yellow lines are still there. In any case, I'll press on. Now, what is interesting here for me is that we have in this mythical family these two figures, these two witches, Circe and Medea, firmly located in the east of the Greek world, in fact, in the far east of the Black Sea. This is a historical map of the region of Colchis, roughly modern Georgia, right? Just depicting what we're talking about. So it's a city of Phasis here and Aya further inland, which are important. So they're both located in the east, and this makes sense in the terms of the mythology because they are related to Helios, the sun, who of course rises in the east. Right? And this relationship is further highlighted by the names of these figures and where they live. And so we have Aeetes himself, who in the novel, this name is explained as being related to the word for eagle in Greek. This is a traditional explanation of the name, but remember that an alternative word, an alternative name for his country is Aya. So another way of understanding the name Aeetes is the man from Aya. Meanwhile, Circe lives in Aya. Right? So what we have here is a complex of myth and names, which points more or less clearly to the original location of these figures, or their association at any rate, with the east of the Black Sea, the far east, the land of the rising sun in the early Greek imagination. Right? And this is spelt out for us more or less explicitly in some of the earliest references to the Argonautic tradition, that is the mythology about Jason and the Argonauts, and by extension about Medea. And so we have here two fragments from the early Greek poet Mimnermus, a bit of a shady figure for us today, but we know that he came from the coast of modern Turkey in ancient Greek. In the ancient Greek world, this was known as Ionia, and lived in the late 7th century BC, and clearly seems to have written quite a bit about the story of Jason, the Argonauts, and with that Medea. And so here, what he's doing is describing where Jason went and where Jason returned from. So here we have in the first fragment, nor ever would Jason himself have brought back the great fleece, that is the golden fleece, from Aya, completing that arduous journey as he performed the difficult trial for arrogant Peleus. Nor would they have reached Oceanus's fair stream, that is the stream of ocean imagined as a river running around and circling the world. And following up in a related fragment, Aeetes' city, where swift Helios's rays are stored, in a golden chamber by the edge of Oceanus, where godlike Jason went. Right? So what we see here is early Greek poetry placing Aeetes, the man from the land of Aya, very clearly in the east, in the land of the rising sun. So far, so good. This fits in very nicely with what we already know about the story of Jason and the Argonauts. And just to illustrate this here, for anybody who might not be familiar with it, we have the journey of Jason with his helpful crew of heroes from the city of Iolcus here. And then his outward journey is illustrated here by the green line, all the way to Colchis in the east of the Black Sea. And then the arduous, rather tortured journey, fabulous journey on top of that, back home. I'll be coming back to the Argonautica and its relationship to the Odyssey in a little moment. In any case, point simply, Jason and the Argonauts travel east. So far, so good. How does Circe fit into this? That's the question that I want to raise. Now, interestingly, in the Odyssey itself, Circe is also in the east and associated with the dawn, the rising sun. So here, for instance, this is from the very beginning of Book 12 of the Odyssey. I'm using the translation by Richmond Lattimore here, in which we've just heard the story of how Odysseus went to the underworld and is now making his way back from the underworld, from Hades, back to Circe. And this is what we have. Now, when our ship had left the stream of the ocean river and come back to the wide crossing of the sea's waves and to the island of Aiaia, where lies the house of the early dawn, her dancing spaces, and where Helios, the sun, makes his uprising. Right? So again, this is fitting in with the mythological picture that we get from the relationship between Circe and Medea on the one hand, and from both of these figures' relationship to Helios, the sun, on the other. This is confirmed by another sort of interesting, elusive tidbit of ancient mythology. This is a fragment or a reference to a fellow called Pherecydes, who compiled and tried to give explanations for ancient myths from Athens in the 5th century. And so this is a student or a scholar making notes in the margins of his text, in the margins of his copy of the Argonautica by Apollonius. And he says that Aiaia, i.e. the island where Circe lives, is an island in the river Phasis, where the golden fleece was kept. And the Phasis is the river that indeed runs through Colchis, or Aia, right? So in other words, we have the Odyssey poet himself placing Circe in the Far East, the land of the rising sun, and we have this later mythological tradition that is situating the island of Circe right near those of her relatives, Aeetes and Medea. And in fact, it's the home of the Golden Fleece. Again, so far so good, apart from a minor issue, right? Namely, the story of Odysseus doesn't take place in the Black Sea, and it doesn't take place in the far east of the Greek world, right? Circe, in fact, is located, as far as we can gather, somewhere in the west of the Mediterranean Sea, in the imaginary world of the Odyssey. And so here we have an attempt at a modern reconstruction of Odysseus's journeys. Now, this is something that people have been playing around with since ancient times, trying to map on where Odysseus went and what he did onto the real world. Obviously, something of a hopeless endeavor, trying to match myth with reality. But in any case, the basic point here is that Circe is somewhere in the west all of a sudden in the story of Odysseus. Right, the story where we know Circe best. And this is developed in other aspects of the Circe myth. So we have Circe's home Aiaia somewhere in the west of the Mediterranean for her to meet Odysseus. We also have several of her mythological children being associated in particular with the Italian peninsula. Right? So amongst the many children, not many, but the several children attributed to Circe or given to Circe in ancient mythology. We have Latinus, from whom we are meant to get the word Latin from. We have Romos, who is apparently another founder of the ancient city of Rome. And we have Telegonus, right, a figure who does come up in Circe, who is meant to be the founder of Tusculum, a town just outside of Rome. And this is an association that has lasted to the present day. This picture, we have Mount Circe, basically, on the coast of Italy, in Montecitorio. Beg your pardon. So we have a real puzzle here. We have, on the one hand, the relationship between Circe and Medea, which points east, and we find evidence of this in ancient Greek poetry and these little fragmentary tidbits all over the place. On the other hand, the myth, the epic in which Circe is best known to us, the Odyssey, Circe is very much associated with the Western Mediterranean, and in particular, the Italian peninsula. So the puzzle for us is how to make sense of this. And one way of trying to understand it is to make better sense of what the Odyssey poem is as a poem and how exactly it is working with this tradition, this mythology that had come before it. And so this is where what I was referring to when I said this is what I think about when I'm not teaching. And indeed, a lot of ink has been spilt on this subject. A few preliminaries, and just to highlight the main point of what other scholars have already found and have already attempted to unpack about the place of Circe in the Odyssey and the Odysseus myth and its relationship to the myth of Jason, Medea, and the Argonauts. First of all, when we talk about poetry, we tend to think of fixed works of literature, that is, things that have been written down, they are published, they have definitive versions, right? And at the same time, as a result of this, the characters, right, and the narratives, the basic outlines of these plots, are given fairly stable forms. When we turn to the Iliad and the Odyssey, by contrast, which are quite early in Greek history, they date to sometime before 600 BC, we are looking not at the works of a literate culture, but we're looking at the end point of a very long tradition of song that was performed orally primarily. That is to say that they were sung, they weren't written as part of the practice of composing them. And related to this, they were unstable in form, right? They continuously changed in different performances. It's almost like ad-libbing. This is a sort of idea that we should think. You have a basic myth, certain story patterns, linguistic formulae, names and epithets that can be strung together in order to produce an evocative and entertaining story at any given moment. Right? Contrast this with later Greek poetry, including the tragedy Medea by Euripides, and this later epic I've referred to already, the Argonautica by Apollonius of Rhodes. These are written works that come quite a bit later in Greek history that are very conscious of their relationship not only to previous literature, in the case of Apollonius, his relationship to Medea, but also the relationship to the previous epic or poetic tradition represented by the Iliad and the Odyssey. Now, this is important because it helps us come to grips, or at least start to come to grips, with what's going on in the place of Circe in the Odyssey, right? Because what we find in the Odyssey is that Odysseus is in fact quite conscious of Jason and the Argonauts and their own adventures. Though interestingly, we don't find reference to Medea. In any case, just a bit further on from that passage in Book 12, where he describes his return to Aiaia and to Circe from Hades, he gets some instructions from Circe, Odysseus gets instructions from Circe on how to return home or how to get back to Ithaca. Right. And Circe lays out two paths for him in this otherwise long and difficult journey. He can either go by the wandering rocks, or he can go by the way of Scylla and Charybdis. Of course, he goes down the second path, makes his own fame that way. But at this very moment where Circe is describing his two options, she also points to the precedent set by Jason and the Argonauts. This is what Circe says. No ship of men that came here, that is to the wandering rocks, has ever fled through. Right, so the idea is that these rocks roam about, float about, and crash into anything that tries to pass them. So no ship of men that came here has ever fled through, but the waves of the sea and the storms of ravening fire carry away the ships, timbers, and men's bodies. That way, the only seagoing ship to get through was Argo, who is in all men's minds, on her way home from Aeetes. And even she would have been driven on the great rocks that time, but Hera saw her through out of her great love for Jason. Now, there's quite a bit that can be said about this passage and about the relationship between Odysseus and Jason here. But for my purposes, all I want to highlight is that the Odyssey poet or singer is aware of this tradition of Jason and the Argonauts in shaping his own poem or his own song. And he's conscious of it in a way that also dictates or directs the way in which he's going to craft his own tale of Odysseus. Right? You have these two options. Jason and the Argonauts have already done option one. Therefore, Odysseus follows a second and a new path, and thus creates a new song, a new form of entertainment, the Odyssey. This is interesting for the relationship between Circe and Medea because it raises some really interesting puzzles about the extent to which the story of the Odyssey is modeled more or less directly on the story of, or an older version of the story of Jason and the Argonauts. Again, this can get a bit complicated, but what I've highlighted here is a sequence of events that occur in the Odyssey And in bold with asterisks there are those that are associated in one way or another with the story of Jason and the Argonauts, or more generally with this mythical tradition that is situated in the Far East and associated with Helios. Right, so you start more or less with Circe. Circe, of course, is giving Odysseus these instructions, and you end with the scene, the cattle of Helios, these cattle who occupy a humorous moment at the beginning of Madeline Miller's novel. Right. The point here is that you have a sequence of consecutive moments in the story of Odysseus, which are associated with, or arguably associated with, the story of Jason, the Argonauts, and Medea, which could be cut out of the story of Odysseus and the form of the Odyssey in the form that we have, without really affecting the flow of the narrative too much. And in fact, you'd remove a lot of doubling from the story in the Odyssey. So for instance, most famously, you have Odysseus encountering the Cyclops and incurring the wrath of Poseidon after he kills the Cyclops, who happens to be the son of that god. Right? And it's because of the wrath of Poseidon that Odysseus is frustrated in his attempts to return home. Right? In the process of his wanderings, right, he is waylaid by storms and other things, but he is stranded ultimately with Circe before he tries to get away, only to incur the wrath of another god, Helios, who then goes on to prevent his return yet again, when Odysseus is stuck now with a different goddess, Calypso. Right? If you remove the section with Circe and Helios, you end up with a much simpler narrative, where you go with the wrath of Poseidon, being stuck on the island with Calypso, and then ultimately getting back home. Right? I'm not saying that by any means that the story of Circe in any way is somehow inauthentic or fake, but what we do have, what we have some evidence, some inkling of from the Odyssey, is some interaction between these two mythical traditions, in which a story that is located in the Black Sea and in the East, associated with the rising sun in Greek mythology and the Greek imagination, is transposed into the western part of the Mediterranean to fit in with the story of Odysseus. All right. The question for me and for this talk is, what does that mean for the figure of Circe herself in the Odyssey? She, of course, comes from that constellation of characters, figures, divinities associated with the rising sun. What was her role in this original form, or this older form of the Argonaut myth? And by extension, what is her relationship to the figure of Medea here? Right? Lots of possibilities have been raised. One suggestion is that Circe was a sort of guide figure in this older version of the Argonaut myth, in which Circe, on this island in Aia, right next to Aia or Colchis, and the site of the Golden Fleece, somehow helped Medea and Jason on their way back to Iolcus. Alternatively, you have the possibility that the figure of, or figures of Medea and Circe are two sides of the same coin in myth. That is, that you have the love interest and the helper of Jason or Odysseus, as the case may be, rolled into one, right? And the two traditions bring them apart: a Circe for Odysseus and a Medea for Jason, right? Anywho, complicated stuff. I just want to pause there to see if anybody has any questions so far, because from here I'm going to turn to the novel.
We don't have any questions in the chat so far, but everyone is reminded that if you do have a question, please post it in the chat.
Very good. Thank you, Julie. And of course, if you have any questions about any part of this, can please ask it at the end. Anywho, so to turn now to the novel and the afterlife of Circe and Medea, what I've tried to sketch out is a complicated and murky story about the deeper history of Greek mythology and the way that these are presented to us in ancient epic and poetry. Right? We can only recover some of the outlines of the relationship between Circe and Medea, their origins in myth. But what is more or less clear is that the Odyssey is in some way modeled on what we find in the story of Jason and the Argonauts. What we find in Miller's novel, by contrast, is that Circe is modeled in one way or another on the figure of Medea, right? Yes, on the figure of Medea, and at the same time, her story also shapes the way in which we see Medea in her novel, right? So, what we're talking about, what we're looking at in particular here, is chapter 13 of Miller's novel, which follows in broader outline the version of the myth of Jason and Medea that we find in the Argonautica, that is the epic poem by Apollonius of Rhodes, with some important changes that I'll mention in a second. In any case, the backstory here given by Jason himself in the novel: "My name is Jason, heir by rights to the kingdom of Iolcus. My father was a virtuous king, but soft-hearted, and when I was a child, my uncle seized the throne from him." This is Pelias, who came up earlier. "He said he would return it to me when I was grown if I gave him proof of my worth, a golden fleece kept by a sorcerer in his land of Colchis." And we find out that Medea was instrumental to Jason's success in this mission. You see it depicted in this vase on the left from southern Italy. There's Jason, the golden fleece, and you can see, I had to cut it a bit, but you can see Medea's hand sticking out on the side there, drugging the serpent on the tree. That is more or less an agreement with what we get in myth, what we find in the novel. But here's where things get slightly different. In the version that Miller offers us, we have Medea helping Jason get the golden fleece through her magic, through her potions. And Jason and Medea are in turn pursued by Aeetes himself. In order to stop Aeetes, Medea murders her brother, whom she had brought along with her, in order to basically delay him. In essence, she knew that they couldn't outrun Aeetes, and so she gets Jason, implores Jason to kill Absyrtus, and then butchers his body herself, casts him into the sea, such that Aeetes is forced to stop in order to collect the pieces of his body so that he can offer him proper burial. A gruesome tale indeed. It gets even more complicated because Medea, in fact, gives us two versions of this story in Madeline Miller's novel. She gives one which is for Jason's ears, right? Namely that Medea herself was overcome by madness and desperation, told Jason to kill Absyrtus, and then did the butchering herself. And then after Jason is knocked out, drugged by Medea, Medea reveals to Circe that she was in fact not mad, and this was calculated. Right? Her only defense is that some lovers are called mad. Right? By contrast, in the Apollonius version, we have Medea helping Jason, and Medea and Jason being pursued not by Aeetes, but by her brother Absyrtus. Right? And Absyrtus pursues them quite a long way. In fact, he corners them, forces them to negotiate, and it's in the midst of these negotiations that Medea sets a trap, and Jason then murders Absyrtus. Right? So quite different situations, both in Miller's version and this version from ancient epic. And talk a bit about why that's the case in a moment, or some of the possibilities thrown up by this in a moment. Then we come back to a point of agreement between these two versions of the myth. They, in both versions, the novel and this other epic, Medea and Jason come to Circe in order to be purified. They need ritual cleansing because of this murder. And here an early modern depiction of the gruesome butchery. Okay. So what's going on here? How is it interesting, and how is it bringing together not only the modeling of Circe and Medea on each other, but also this long history of a mythic tradition that has been mutually influential. That is, the figure of Circe influencing the figure of Medea and vice versa. Right. Several things are notable about this chapter, chapter 13 in Miller's novel. So first of all, we have quite a bit of preparation, a lot of groundwork, which namely seems to suggest that Circe's story is the model for Medea's story within this chapter. Right? So in particular, we have the story developed, the plotline developed of the relationship between Glaucus and Circe, of course, leading to Circe's exile. And in the previous chapter, we had just had reference to Theseus and Ariadne. So in both cases, we have basically these jilted lovers, Circe and Ariadne, betrayed and abandoned by these otherwise problematic and superficial hero figures, or divine figures in the case of Glaucus. And so this is looking forward, I suggest, to what we get in the meeting between Medea and Circe. Right? Circe is going to see Jason for what he is and what he's going to do in the tradition, namely abandon Medea. At the same time, I want to highlight something else which strikes me as quite interesting, and that is the way in which mythical time and narrative time interact in the novel, or have interacted in the first 12 chapters of the novel up to the point where we meet Medea and her encounter with Circe. That is to say that normally, well, the novel as a whole is written from the perspective of, or looks back at what has happened, right? It's all written in the past tense. And as a result of this, it's often written or often narrated with the benefit of hindsight on the one hand, or with the benefit of added information. So in the case of the story of Theseus and Ariadne in the previous chapter, for example, not only is Circe looking back on what has happened to her, looking back on events in the history of the myth, within the myth that is, she also has the story filled in for her by Hermes. Now I'm highlighting this because that's something that is missing in the case of Medea. What I want to suggest is that the reason that it's missing is because A, the relationship between Circe and Medea in myth and in narrative is so close to begin with, and B, because this entire chapter is very elusive, playing with the different threads of tradition and myth, some of which had already interacted in the past in the Odyssey in particular. So in the first instance, the idea here that we see Medea through Circe's eyes, and that is through Circe's previous experiences, and in particular the story of her relationship to Glaucus. So here, for instance, we have the arrival of Jason and Medea, and it's interesting the way in which Circe's comments, or the inner voice that we're given access to through the narration, already undercuts the figure of Jason and is in fact very distrusting of him and his fidelity to Medea. Right, so in the first instance, just after Jason has given his version of events, we have here in Circe's voice now, in his mind, he was already telling the tale to his court, to wide-eyed nobles and to fainting maidens. He did not thank Medea for her aid. He scarcely looked at her, as if a demigoddess saving him at every turn was only his due. Right. Now, thinking back to what I was saying about the Odyssey and the Argonautic myth, right, where we have the figure of Circe and Odysseus standing in some relationship to this broader body of myth around the figure of Jason and Medea, right, we have now an instance where the figure of Circe within the novel is providing, or at least pointing to the story of Medea herself. Right? Circe has herself also been betrayed by a man who has been the beneficiary of Circe's good deeds. In the case of Glaucus, he's been turned into a god, and he has run off, not thought about Circe, betrayed her after that. And beyond this, when talking more candidly with Medea, trying to warn Medea about Jason, we have Circe here not providing a prophecy, but pretty much outlining exactly what will happen to Medea in her own line of myth. Circe says, "You are a foreigner." Then she reflects, "I could see it suddenly, as plain as if it were painted before me. The factious nobles waiting at home for Jason's return, each jockeying to match their daughter with the new-made hero and claim a piece of his glory. Medea would be the one thing they would agree upon. They will resent you," she said. "Worse, they will suspect you, for you are the daughter of a sorcerer and a witch in your own right. You have lived only in Colchis. You cannot know how Pharmakeia is feared among mortals. They will undermine you at every turn. It will not matter that you help Jason. They will push that aside or else use it against you as proof of your unnaturalness." Right? Now, I couldn't exactly find a picture of what Circe is describing here, but here on the left, we have another vase painting with Circe performing one of her deeds in Iolcus that comes to us from myth. Namely, Peleus, Jason's uncle, refuses to give up the throne. However, he is getting old, and Medea comes up with a plan to get him out of the way. Namely, fools him into letting her chop him up and in an attempt to rejuvenate him. And so this is her with a cauldron. She's thrown in some chopped bits of sheep, and out jumps a revived sheep. Right. What's interesting for me again here is that the story that Circe is outlining could be, with a few minor additions, be Circe reflecting on her own story in the novel, right? She is the one who is punished as a sorceress because of Pharmakeia. She is cast out. She is the Titan as opposed to the Olympians, foreign in that respect, right? Unnatural for her Pharmakeia. Natural also for not being quite as powerful in her divinity as her siblings or her father. And so very much shaping the story of Medea through the experience of Circe within the novel. And in fact, Circe is more or less explicit about seeing Medea as a doublet of herself and her own experiences. When she's trying to warn Medea about Jason and trying to convince her to part ways with him, she says, "Let him be a hero. You are something else." "What is that?" asks Medea. And then Circe thinks, "In my mind, I saw us already, our heads bent together over the purple flowers of aconite, the black roots of moly. I would rescue her from her tainted past. A witch," I said, "with unbound power, who need answer to none but herself." "I see," says Medea, "like you, a pathetic exile who stinks of her loneliness." Right? So not only do we see Medea through Circe's eyes in light of Circe's experiences within this novel, right? She is more or less openly saying, or promising to Medea, an alternate path in her own story, one in which she's going to occupy the same place as Circe, right? The witch on the island. There is some irony here, of course, because, as I mentioned, the figure of Circe in the Odyssey is related in some way to the Argonautic myth. And we have the possibility here that the figure of Circe is relating back or modeled on the figure of Medea. So we have Medea in the oldest version of the myth, Circe in the Odyssey, And now coming back to the novel by Matt and Miller, we have Medea being modeled in turn or viewed in turn through the experiences of Circe. Coming full circle, right? As I mentioned before, what makes this interesting as well is that we don't get, certainly not immediately, the mythical follow-up about Medea. All this information about what lies in store for Medea and Jason comes from Circe's own suppositions based on her own experiences within the narrative. We don't get an additional comment or reflection later on in time. We don't have Hermes swooping down at the very beginning of the next chapter telling us what happened to Medea. The reason for this, I think, is not only because of the relationship, the close relationship between Circe and Medea in myth, which I've mentioned just then, but also their relationship in narrative, the way in which they have played similar roles, similar positions in these different versions of the myth, helping Odysseus on the one hand, helping Jason on the other, and within the novel, the relationship between Glaucus and Circe on the one hand, Medea and Jason on the other. So I want to just highlight here one additional aspect of the figure of Medea and the way it's crafted in this chapter, namely the way that it's done through allusion, right? That is to say that although we are missing the mythical follow-up here explaining what happens to Medea in myth, at least it's missing directly after their encounter in chapter 13, right? The version of the myth presented in the chapter points very much, I think, towards the version of the myth that's famous, it's canonical, thanks to Euripides' Medea, namely the story that Medea murdered her children in order to punish Jason in a fit of rage, mad rage. This is paralleled in the story that we find in the chapter in the way in which the murder of Apsyrtus is itself a calculated affair. That Medea, in fact, fools Jason, and we have this revelation in a conversation with Circe, showing that she has in fact planned this out. She's mad with love, so to say. Right? Again, this is a reading of what is famous in Euripides' version of this myth, and one that has had enormous influence on the figure of Medea in later traditions. And what's striking then, if you look at this chapter more broadly, is the way in which it is really quite so self-conscious, right? Medea and Jason arrive as if they were expected guests. Ironic, perhaps, because they indeed are expected guests in the version of the story of Jason and Medea given to us by Apollonius of Rhodes. Right. At the same time, Jason himself is lost in the details of his own legend, right? His play acting almost. He knows he has a myth, a role to play in it, and he's going to play it out. And similarly, we have the case of Medea herself, who was already threatening to use her powers to prevent anybody from taking Jason away from her. Right. So a very self-conscious play with the tradition, which allows Miller here, I think, to create a character for Medea, sort of playing around with both the tradition and her relationship to Circe without spelling it out for us, right, which adds to the tension, adds to the foreboding of this encounter. Oops. Okay, so that was my talk. That's what I've covered, all the ground I wanted to cover. In essence, again, this idea that the Odyssey and the figure of Circe is related to a prior tradition, an older tradition of the Argonautic myth involving Jason and Medea. And then the novel of Circe, which picks up and continues this tradition, as well as continuing the way in which these different versions of the story are brought together in order to enrich the version that she offers herself. Okay, so thank you very much for your attention. Were there any questions? I know I covered a lot of ground and I moved relatively quickly. Were there any questions, anything that I could clarify or explain or go back to?
Yes, Katie has a question. She says, I'm less familiar with the myth of Circe pre-Odyssey. Does she ever get revenge analogous to that of Medea?
It's a very interesting question. So the earliest Greek myths don't cover that phase of Circe's life, and the business to do with Scylla in the novel comes, in fact, from Roman sources. So we have Roman poets like Ovid creating prequels, in essence, to the figures that they encounter in the Homeric poems. So in terms of that particular point, though, whether or not Circe gets her revenge on somebody like Glaucus or the like, not quite, not through killing children at any rate, but she does turn Scylla into a beast. And we have this other story of, I think his name is Picus, an early king in Italy, who also gets his comeuppance. Not quite as brutal as Medea, however, as far as I'm aware.